This evening is that this House regrets our faith in science, and I shall now call upon Julie Leanne to propose the motion.
Ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen, I am not here today to shit on Bill Nye the Science Guy. Nor am I here nor do I think that the onus is on the proposition in this debate to make the case that we should regret science itself, that we should regret advances in medicine, space travel, things like this, which have been arguably quite good for human society. Instead, I think we should address the fact that our faith in science actually has very little bearing on what science really is, and I'm going to address some of the harms that arise from this. So, if we're looking for a definition of science, it's not something we can easily come up with, but how about we go with something like the systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions of the universe. Thank you, Wikipedia. So if this is what science actually is, then I think maybe a stock photo of a scientist is the kind of science that most of us actually are familiar with or have faith in, you know, somebody kind of wearing a lab coat and no other appropriate safety equipment, pouring a mysterious substance into another mysterious substance in a test tube that's probably going to explode. So the point I'm making here is that our faith in science has been taught to us without being taught to think critically about what is presented to us as scientific. In this way, it is a blind faith, and that is something which we as a society should regret. I think a good example of this is BuzzFeed articles, many of which I've seen genuinely use the phrase, according to science. What does that mean? And yet, this word alone seems to give credence to things which otherwise have no bearing on fact. So, my first point about this is that such a blind faith in science leads people to buy into pseudoscience, which is often willfully propagated. Our blind faith in science is capitalized on at every available opportunity. A good example of this is often seen on social media, for example. One of my favorite words to come out of this is nutribollocks, which is basically where bollocks nutrition facts are propagated to us in order to sell us products which have no actual bearing on our health. So alkaline diets, ketogenic diets, detoxing, our faith in science is capitalized upon for profit at every turn. Skinny teas, detox water, skinny coffee is a thing. It has 254,000 Instagram followers. Coffee isn't meant to make you skinny, it's meant to make you ascend to an astral plane where you can actually write college essays. And yet, because it has the word science on it, people are actually buying it, and that comes from that blind faith in science. So our overzealous faith in science actually leads people to buy into this nonsense, and it has led us to buy anything that claims to be scientific or is laid out scientifically. Now, this, I think, has some very clear impacts and harms. So the lack of truth in the way that we conceptualize science leads to, in turn, to a lack of faith in actual science. For example, the anti-vax movement. You see the kind of skeptical thinking that should be used to think scientifically about things being directed back at proven science that is massively to the benefit of society, because our faith in science has been misdirected at every turn. It is little wonder that people are skeptical of proven science, like vaccinations, when we have been sold so many lies with the word science branded onto them. Okay.
Surely though, when explaining the justification behind like a vaccination, most people don't understand the lingo, so when they try to critically engage with that, they're always going to think that there's something that I'm missing, and that's why people are anti-vaxxers, and that often is why people don't buy into medicine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is part of the problem, is that science is inherently difficult to synthesize down for people who don't have a specialist knowledge of it. And I think especially when you get to the level, I'm going to talk about things like empirical evidence and stuff in a minute, when you get to the level that it is not something you can visually observe in your own life, it becomes inherently more difficult to believe. So on that note of our faith in science leading us to believe things that aren't true, it is incredibly difficult to shake off beliefs that we once thought were scientifically true, but have turned out to be false. And this can have huge, immeasurable negative consequences. For example, I think, so Victorian scientists, even Charles Darwin, lacked the necessary mechanisms to explain biological inheritance. So prior to the discovery of genetics, all we had to go on was kind of visual empirical evidence and physical differences, like craniology, the practice of measuring skull length. So this was ultimately used to create the narrative of the superior European and the inferior other. And these social Darwinist theories were widely proliferated. So before this discovery of DNA, such practices gave scientific credence to the notion of ethnic superiority, which is obviously false. Did I say obviously? Not to everybody. So practices of scientific racism were only denounced by the United Nations in 1950 after their consequences in the Second World War. And at this stage, the UN still divided humanity into 3 distinct races. So we know all of this to be false now, but white supremacy movements continue to hark back to these racial sciences because we used to think they were true, even though they are pseudoscience. So producing scientific articles to prove a point. And the problem is that people buy it because it is presented in a scientific layout. Our faith in science is exploited by white supremacists to prop up their views, as there is a subset of the population that will believe their proof just because it has a scientific layout. It's the BuzzFeed phenomenon once more. It has the word science on it, and our faith in science has been cultivated in such a way that people actually believe it. Obviously, there is a cultural element in here. People in power will believe what they want to believe in order to prop up the system that keeps them in power. That can't be denied. But it is our faith in science which has been capitalized upon in order to create this phenomenon. So our faith in science is such that we still haven't shaken off the scientific ideas which we know to be false. I've talked about white supremacy. I'm not going to engage with material from those kind of people because I don't even want to propagate it. But so in 2019, Angela Saini released a book called Superior, The Return of Race in Science, and basically proved that certain areas of biology and other areas of our culture are still influenced by scientific racism, even though we know now that it's not true. So this has created a culture which we have yet to effectively dismantle, and even where it isn't explicit, the norms of racism find their roots in this pseudoscience at every turn. Society is so reluctant to adapt to its new discoveries that we still cling to these old scientific beliefs. So basically our faith in science has two very distinct harms. On one hand, it can be capitalized upon to the extent that people are now skeptical of vital proven science and the profit motives behind it. And it also allows science to be used to prop up damaging views which have long since been proven false. Part of the problem here is the structure of society as a whole. Culture doesn't shift fast enough to keep up with new discoveries, so people keep harking back to old science. And on the other hand, we live in a capitalist, profit-driven society where people will always use science, not necessarily for the greater good, but in order to turn a profit for themselves. So in this context, our faith in science, not in the science which has furthered humanity, but which in the science which has been used to our detriment, must be regretted.
I'd like to thank Julie for her fine speech and call upon Maggie to begin the argument for the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think if we're going to place blind faith in anything, and I think human nature dictates that we must, there is no better place to put it than in science. I think science is probably the best and only thing that we should put our faith in. I think truth is worth believing in. And I know that's not the debate we're having, because I think probably most people aren't going to dispute the idea that there are some things that aren't necessarily knowable, but are worth pretending that are knowable, just for the sake of having a cohesive society where we all get along and we all agree on certain things. But I think stories like myths like truth are something that's worth believing in. Like myths like justice and equality are something that are worth believing in. And I think that science, as something that is greater than just a bunch of papers published by white men, is something that's worth believing in. Because science is a systematic way of looking at the world, which has generally produced the best results out of kind of any other worldview we've tried so far. Because I think it's easy to say that science is indistinguishable from any other kind of thing that we might have faith in, any other kind of religion. I know my Leaving Cert physics teacher liked to tell us a story about how when people started getting into like mechanics and like calculating, things like velocity and acceleration, and you could throw a rock and you could say that rock is going to hit the ground in like 11.5 seconds. People would be like, that person's a witch, because that's how you respond to people being able to tell things about the future. But that's basically all the scientific method is a system of coming up with an idea about the way the world is, looking at how that idea functions in reality and, either accepting it or improving on it at some point. So I think that's the fundamental thing about science, which makes it different from any other belief system that you hold. Because in any other belief system, you are operating off of a set of principles that are axiomatic, that these are your a priori beliefs, and everything in the world must conform to them. I think in science, the fundamental thing about science is that it contains the seeds of its own improvement, which is actually what seeds are, even though most of the time when people start off a sentence with, it contains the seeds of its own, the last word is destruction, which I think is a weird thing to compare seeds to. Anyway, all systems of belief are about trying to explain the world. I think the scientific method is the best way we have of actually attempting to explain the real world. I think when Julie talks about how we've had theories about the world in the past that were wrong, and those theories cause huge amounts of damage. I could talk for a really long time about the amount of damage that has been done by not having enough women in science, by not considering the fact that like half the population has a menstrual cycle or something when you're developing a drug, or like not considering the fact that the sort of like white culture is not the like fundamental way that humans are or something. Look, what science like uniquely has over other unique systems is the ability to evolve when it is proven wrong. I think when Julie talks about people using these theories that have been largely discredited to like prop up their own racist beliefs, I think they had those racist beliefs in the first place, and they were going to continue having them regardless. And look, and the use of science there is really just an appeal to an authority, where if not science, that would be replaced by any other kind of authority. Look, I think what's actually regrettable here, I think what's regrettable is like the development of a post-truth world where we think it's okay to just accept this idea that some people are going to refuse to believe certain things that have been like widely accepted by a community of experts, and we think that's fine that they're going to do that, or at least we accept that they will. Or people will just respond to anything with, well, there's no objective truth, so why bother thinking about truth as a useful or attainable thing at all? I think what we should regret is this politicization of science in a world where the reality of climate change is a political issue, where you, like, as a Republican senator, could probably be voted out for saying that I think the Earth is getting warmer, even though scientists have been measuring that it has been, like, tangibly getting warmer for decades. I think, like, when we live in a world where people, like, refuse GMOs and, like, vaccinations because they like think that there's some sort of ulterior motive there. I think like those are the things we should regret. I think a world where we're moving away from a trust in science as something that's empirical and something that is above politics is something to be regretted. Because look, I think why we should trust science. I think we should trust science because children are still dying from polio, even though we've been able to vaccinate against polio for years. I think we should trust science because when someone says the Earth is flat and you say, no, it's not, and they say, how do you know? Your only answer is because the scientist told me, because none of us have any sort of verifiable way of knowing that the Earth's not flat. But the thing is, if we all, like, if everyone in the world operated as if the Earth was flat, then you know, lots of things that rely on science wouldn't work. What is this information going to be? Yes, go ahead.
So, like, flat earthers would consider themselves to be like scientists of their own. Like, how do you distinguish? Are you saying that like the scientific establishment, like the people, like how do you distinguish that? Like, scientists are people who do empirical tests and stuff like that. Where's your distinction between like flat earther scientists and?
Well, but I think because people have done empirical tests, the empirical tests say that the Earth isn't flat. I'm not sure. Like, I think actually, like, people have known this for a long time. People like know you can do all sorts of interesting things with astrology. Astrology. Astronomy is the word I was going for. I don't know. I don't really understand either of those. But look, I think we should trust scientists because, like, when a group, like a lobby group of experts, goes to a politician and says, like, here is this research that can like massively improve this thing in your community. I think that they deserve to be listened to because I think that whenever like science offers us something that can improve the lives of people, we should probably take it. And look, I think there's so much to be said about like all of the flaws that exist within science. I think, look, it's unfair to say these are science's fault. I think they're people's fault. I think humans have a lot of problems, but I think science is one way that we have of overcoming them. Honestly, thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. I'd like to now call upon Ellen and Hugh for the case for the. Oh, switch. Okay. Well, then you can
Ben, am I correct in saying this is your first time?
Yes, wave them.
Okay, where are you? If this is your first time speaking in the chamber, you're entitled to what are called maintenance rights, meaning that you won't be out with your eyes, won't interrupt you or ask you a question.
I don't have to accept them, Jack.
Everybody is like, who does so, a thunderous round of applause. So then would you like to keep your rights or waive them?
I'll wave them.
That means you cannot review your rights. Just
I'm definitely going to regret that. So when I was writing this speech, I read the oratory returns and I found that everyone in this debate was going to be science students. So I wrote a wonderful speech about me being the only arts student in this. So it was going to be a great speech. And then Jack Williams decided to join the debate and ruin the entire speech. So that speech is now upstairs, and you too. Well, that speech is now, okay. But the speech is now upstairs in a bin, so that's kind of your fault. But I'm going to talk about there's two negative effects of our faith in science. First one is that we view science as the only legitimate way to solve problems. And the second one is that when science is wrong, as Maggie has already said, the consequences of that because of our faith in science are much worse. So, if we think about there's different types of problems, there's also different types of solving those problems. Science is one way of solving a problem, but there's also loads of different types of ways of solving problems. And there's loads of different types of problems. Science is good at solving certain types of problems, like curing cancer, but it's not good at solving other types of problems, like, say, I don't know, deciding what's for dinner. So that's why we have other ways of solving problems, like debate. But our faith in science means that we see science as the only legitimate way of actually solving a problem. We shoehorn it and make it the only way of actually trying to solve problems. We stop looking at the other ways of solving problems and only try to use science. I think this can best be seen in my own subjects. I'm a political science student, and as my parents would be quite upset to know, I'm not a real science student, just letting you all know. But we try to shoehorn science into my subjects, but really you shouldn't. I could over-intellectualize this, if I was maybe Jack Williams, and say that there's a whole good idea about humanities being inherently valuable, yada, yada, yada. But I'm not going to do that. I'm not clever enough, so I'm just going to talk about concrete impacts. I think the best one to go through is the famine in the past, because back then economic science said, from Malthus for you nerds in the know, that basically said that famines are natural, they should be allowed to happen, there shouldn't be any government intervention. But every other solution, or every other way of approaching this problem would say that's bullshit, basically, sorry for my language. But we didn't listen to them. Our faith in science meant we only listened to the empirical data. Even if the empirical data was wrong and was proven wrong, we still just stayed listening to it. That's why there wasn't a policy response to the Irish famine, to the Scottish famine, to various ones in Germany, etc. Now, on to my second point. Science is like a magic box, right? You science people or whatever, you get your money and you walk into the Hamilton in the morning, right? And then, to me, you just do some magic in there, like it's like Hogwarts or something, and you walk out with a cancer cure and an actually employable degree. But we just have to blindly trust what comes out. And our faith in science means that we do just blindly trust what comes out of Hamilton Hogwarts. But the thing is, if we do that, much like myself, we've got issues. So, if you take the stuff that comes out of Hamilton Hogwarts, it may well be right, but if you throw some buzzwords on anything, like my first speaker already said, you can make it look like it came out of Hamilton Hogwarts. If you don't know, from the outside, our faith in science means we accept every magic box to the same level. Every magic box is treated as true. Because of our faith in science, the magic box could be Hamilton Hogwarts, or it could be Gwyneth Paltrow's vaginal steaming products, but we don't know, we don't try to question which one is actually legitimate. The Gwyneth Paltrow vaginal steaming products, by the way, I'm going to stress that I didn't actually fall personal victim to that scam, but it's kind of a funny but not that serious thing. Like, you might have lost a bit of self-respect and some money if you bought the products, but it's not the end of the world. But I'm going to just mention eugenics. I'm not going to talk about it because, like my first speaker said, it's not something we should. But when you think about the harm things like that have caused, it's because there was buzzwords attached to it. People just take that as a given. They don't look at the magic box that eugenics came out of and question whether that was right or wrong. They just saw science correct. They didn't actually question whether the science was correct because of their faith in it. Are you going to give me a POI or not? Yeah.
Most of the science that you're talking about, the things that people interact with, often are regulated, or how they interact with that or actually affect them have to be regulated so that people don't have the harms that you're talking about. And that is often scientists who create those solutions, opposed to some wacky pseudoscience that often.
Okay, yeah, I'll take the point that we try to regulate it, but how effectively do we actually regulate it? Because I'm sure you're going to point out later on that there's anti-vaxxers, yada, 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 and also the thing with the famine and Gwyneth Paltrow. It kind of shows that we don't actually effectively regulate it. We may try, but we just don't, and that's a whole other argument inherent in our society, and I'm not going to talk about it. But if we look at the major flaw in this and our faith in science, is that science is implemented by non-scientists, right? Most of the policies that we actually come up with because of scientific findings are implemented not by the scientists themselves, but are implemented by people like me who did geography for Leaving Cert, and that was the closest I've ever got to a science. Because we don't understand what the science is. We can't judge between the magic boxes. We have to try. We have to not just have blind faith in the science and try to differentiate between what is a good magic box, a cancer cure, and what is another bad magic box, like all the other examples I've talked about earlier. But I'm not advocating getting rid of science, like the opposition will probably talk about, and they have already. I'm merely saying that we should put it in its proper place as one potential solution to potential problems, not every potential solution to every potential problem. It can be used in certain circumstances, but it shouldn't be used in every circumstance. We should question it. We should question whether we have to use science, not just blindly trust. Oh, I'm excited. The auditor's giving me a question. Come on.
Can you name a solution that is better than science at solving any problems?
Yes. Look around the room. We're having a debate. So we're not having a statistical study or anything on this question about whether science is good or not. We're having a debate about it. That's another way of solving a problem. We're not doing a scientific study on it. We're just having a debate. So that's another way of solving a problem. Does that not answer your question? Yeah, that's pretty much me. Yeah, thank you.
All right. I'd like to thank Ben for his fine speech and call upon Killian Gartland, if that's all right, to plead the case of the opposition.
Faith in science is a must. If we do not believe in objective truths, then misinformation will be king. When this is the case, we see exploitation and death, not to be dramatic. The main point I'd like to make tonight is that there's a big difference between faith in science and faith in individual scientists, which is something that the proposition find may be hard to understand. So I'm going to talk a bit about the system of science and how we can prove things like pseudoscience are false. So, Alexis Carrel won a Nobel Prize in 1912 for his work in transplantation. That same year, he began an experiment using a chicken heart that appeared to show that cells could replicate indefinitely outside of the body, once given the right nutrients. This experiment continued until 1946. Other scientists tried to repeat this experiment, but for a long time, nobody could. They blamed their own incompetence because of the status that surrounded the Nobel Prize winner. We now know that the only cells that can replicate indefinitely outside the body are cancer cells. And it turns out that any of the successful repeats of Carrel's original experiment were only successful because these cells were actually cancerous. So replication is necessary to prove anything in science. This experiment could not be replicated, but was still widely believed by individuals who trusted one person over an overwhelming amount of contradictory data. And for those interested, the reason the chicken heart kept replicating was not because of cancer, but because some of the fluid that was added to it was taken from chick embryos, which had fresh young cells that had not been properly filtered out from the liquid. So, as Kanye West once said, no one man should have all that power. Individual scientists are fallible, but the scientific process reveals the truth, so we must have faith in it. Whether we're looking at cells under the microscope, reactions in a flask, stars through telescopes, or mice in a microwave, scientists are interested in one thing, the objective truth. So how do we maintain objectivity when individual scientists are fallible? Let me tell you about a beautiful thing called peer review. This process means that before work is published in a credible scientific journal, it is reviewed by experts in the field. In their papers, scientists must be open about their conflicts of interest, which are usually mentioned at the end of their papers. So, if a study showed that cigarettes prolong your life, but was funded by Marlboro, it would have a very large burden of proof in order to be seen as objective truth by scientists, and especially because of the massive studies that continuously show the opposite. So until studies by parties without a conflict of... Yes, go ahead.
Do you expect every member of the public to go out and check scientific peer-reviewed journals every time they come across a scientific point of view?
No, I don't. But I think this debate is about our faith in science, and if you trust science, you trust scientists that peer-reviewed journals and that sort of thing will do the right thing and will only allow publishment of proper science. Of course, there are some times where that isn't the case, like in Andrew Wakefield's paper, which started the whole anti-vax movement, but it means that if you have faith in science and something proves that wrong, then you'll change your mind. So, where was I? So, yeah, until studies by parties without a conflict of interest with larger sample sizes repeated this experiment and showed the same thing, it would not be believed. So, that's why it's important to repeat research. So, failing to publish findings can also be seen as dangerous as publishing cherry-picked findings. So, in the US, Exxon scientists in the 1980s knew much more about the impending climate crisis than other scientists around the world because they had a huge budget behind them to look at this area. But the company would put itself at a disadvantage if these findings were released to the world. So it wasn't the science that was at fault here, but rather the individuals and institutions that had the responsibility to share what they had found with the world. So thanks to peer review and the scientific community that respect it, privatization of research usually isn't damaging to science as a whole. Many pharmaceutical companies have the money to carry out research into some essential but more profit-driven areas of research that public researchers cannot afford to pursue. However, open science is the ideal scenario. Most scientists are well aware that no matter what you expect from your results before the experiment, you should publish what you get. So, even if your experiment failed to meet your expectations, you should still show the world your results. Others interested in the area might read it to gain some knowledge, might modify the experiment to see if the results change, or if they're a bit suspicious, they can repeat the experiment and might end up correcting the record or increasing the amount of evidence that proved your point. Science is at its best when completely open, and thankfully it is increasingly open for anyone to view. This is because of the pressure from the many scientists who advocate for this, and from websites such as Sci-Hub, which removed the paywall needed to access many research papers. Shout out to Sci-Hub. The dangers of the novel coronavirus have facilitated the sharing of major findings around it. So hopefully this trend continues. And not just the open science trend. I'll be really annoyed if there isn't a horrific outbreak when I'm finally an immunologist. So I said the privatization of research of science isn't always a problem. However, it is a massive part of anti-science. When we lose our faith in science, capitalism does its thing, and this industry thrives. There are many examples of this. There are businesses where you pay a medium to tell you that a deceased loved one is trying to contact you from beyond the grave. They use vague and common points about people to convince you of their legitimacy. Similarly, paying someone to predict your future based on the position of the stars as you were born is also something that exists, because apparently some people believe that the universe literally revolves around them. That being said, I'm a Capricorn, and I'm delighted that February will be a month that will have some special moments and time for reflection. So there are plenty of examples of commercial anti-science beyond the Exxon example. However, true anti-science doesn't come from cover-ups, it comes from conspiracy. It's one thing to refuse to believe something is true, but it's something else entirely to create your own truth. Climate change is on track to wipe us out. That is an objective fact. Vaccines work. They protect us against some of the most devastating diseases and have completely wiped out smallpox. The science shows this, and we need as many people as possible to know it, or we will be plagued by climate destruction and disease. For some, convincing people of something else, like that vaccines are dangerous, can be very profitable. This only arises when we lose our faith in science, in the objective truth. Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop is perhaps the most Black Mirror-esque, pessimistic vision of a future where capitalism and anti-science unite. She sells a wide range of products and makes a wide range of claims that can't be backed up. One of her products is a jade egg that you're supposed to put inside your... Look, if you're going to put an object in a hole you know it doesn't belong, just please don't do it for health reasons. Having to explain to a doctor why you put a magic rock inside you is not going to be very good for your aura. So, if we can't trust science, we can't trust truth, and our faith as a species is sealed. It'll spell the end for us all on this beautiful flat disk we call home.
Thank you, Gillian, for that very enlightening speech. I'd like to now call upon Ellen to continue the case.
Sorry, my speech just disappeared. There it is. Look, I know, I'm not a STEM student. I haven't made the long, treacherous walk from the Hamilton to the GMB to speak here tonight. I can't prove theorems or dissect tats or whatever it is you get up to over there. I'm kidding, you guys are amazing. Laura, you're a queen. But you know what? This debate isn't just about you STEM students. Yes, even us Doc Martin wearing, literature quoting, generally pretentious art spot kids can talk about science, because our faith in science has affected every facet of our society. In fact, as I was explaining, our faith in science has infected every facet of our society, from the courses we study, to the conversations we have, to the things we see online. Quick warning, in true art student fashion, this isn't exactly a speech, and is more my attempt to articulate a collection of thoughts that came to my mind at exactly 12 minutes past 5 this morning, when I woke up and actually lay in my bed for like 20 minutes thinking about the debate and then fell asleep. But I have actually managed to put some sort of structure on these thoughts, so I'm going to talk about 3 broad areas in which I have massive problems with our faith in science. So in academia, and I promise I'm not going to talk about Foucault, it's going to be an issue and a struggle, but I'm going to get through it. Some personal issues that I have with it, which is basically a venting opportunity for me, and some broader social problems that our faith in science creates. Again, more venting, this time angrier. That was a really optimistic structure I put on that speech, so the speech is actually a bit of a mess, but we'll keep going with it. So first off, our faith in science has pretty much ruined my degree. Now, I know this seems like a pretty unorthodox statement from me. Like most people who know me will tell you that I love economics and sociology and politics like a worrying amount. And that's still true. I still think they're fascinating and important and can help us to see the world around us in new ways. Not everyone agrees with this. If I had €1 for every time I've heard sociology is not a real subject and economics is just astrology for old white men, I'd be able to buy a house in Ranelagh, adopt 12 cats, and live out the rest of my days reading Foucault in peace. Damn it, I said I wouldn't mention Foucault, but anyway, here we are. So back to my degree. I arrived in Trinity as like a wide-eyed fresher, ready to spend the next 4 years becoming even more of a stereotype than I already was. I walked into my first philosophy religion class, prepared to become like misty-eyed as we pondered the mysteries of the universe. That didn't happen. Instead, we got premises, logical analysis, readings that had more symbols than actual words. I was aghast. Where was the wonder, the joy, the magic? What was this whole new world that I'd walked into? And while not all philosophy was taught in this way, it was indicative of a certain trend within philosophy and the study of humanity as a whole, the over-application of science. Because it wasn't only philosophy which had been corrupted by our faith in science. Every single fucking subject that I study has been ruined by people thinking that they need to sciencify it by introducing assumptions, models, experiments, all of which almost never work. No, Luke, sit down, please. Economics, sociology, politics, they all suffer from it. And because the assumptions and so on are shown not to work so often, we get the whole sociology is faith and economics is astrology for old white men. Valuable subjects are delegitimized and the lessons that we could learn from them are ignored time and time again. But why did this process happen in the first place? I believe it is because of our unwavering faith society has placed in science. From the time of the Enlightenment, science has been seen as the method par excellence by which to study everything. In order for a burgeoning study of society to be seen as legitimate, it had to comply with this method. It had to seek to create generalizable theories based on observations, assumptions, and experiments. There's a whole lot of historical and social and economic debate that I won't go into now, but essentially, out of the scientific, non-scientific divide in the social studies, the scientific side dominated for the majority of the existence of the social studies. Even though thankfully people are starting to move away from a positivist approach to the study of society, the impacts it has had have been incredibly detrimental to the field itself and to those it has attempted to study. I don't have a whole lot of time to go through all of them, but like models of economic behaviour completely tend to ignore women's responses to things like pay changes and wage rates, because they don't take into account the fact that they are often unable to maximise their utility while behaving rationally because of social constraints placed upon them, and because the whole scientific method really places a great deal of importance on the assumption of rationality within humans. This isn't taken into account, and that often a lot of economic policy is really detrimental to women because of these assumptions. And it also lots of things about power relations and research and things like that. So this is the point at which my speech becomes less whimsical and fun and a lot more angry. Because another thing that really, really pisses me off about our faith in science is the amount of times that a man has told me not to worry about walking home alone at night because the likelihood of me being attacked is statistically small. I'm willing to bet that almost every woman here has been told the exact same thing. And I just want to say that even if that is true, and oftentimes and even if it is true, it doesn't make the walk home from the Lewis at 11:30 when there's somebody walking just a little bit too close behind you any less fucking terrifying. The faith in the comfort of statistics doesn't help. It just makes you feel guilty about the fear you experience on a regular basis because you can't justify it rationally. Time and time again, genuine fears are swept aside because they are deemed irrational and improbable. This is related to another common experience, being told that I'm hormonal. I get the scientific idea behind it. I get that at certain times the month, certain hormones, But what I don't think that many people get, especially those who use the idea of hormones to explain away my feelings, is that these hormones don't cause me to become reactionary to certain triggers. The triggers were always there. It's just that now my reactions to them are stronger. So by attempting to explain the emotions in the framework of science, you don't get to the root of the issue, and in fact just detract from the possibility of ever getting to that root. And also, it just doesn't make me feel any better in the moment. In fact, I'm probably more likely to get more upset because telling me that I'm just being hormonal makes me feel that my feelings are being diminished. And look, I know this is vaguely humorous, ha 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 ha, hormones, am I right? But this is all related to a far wider reaching and serious problem of dismissing people's pain and suffering, the pain of women and minorities in particular, because of a scientific fact that can just magically explain it away. It starts with somebody saying that you're just hormonal. It ends with thousands of women from racial minorities in particular dying every year because their requests for urgent medical care are dismissed. Faith in scientific knowledge has surpassed our faith in people's ability to know their own bodies, to recognise the care that they need. So while science, of course, has led to some advancements, our faith in science has negatively impacted how we see other fields of academia, how we interact with others, and how we treat some of the most vulnerable in our society. For all these reasons, I beg to propose the motion.
Thank you, Ellen, for your speech. I'd now like to call upon Jack Williams to begin the case of the opposition.
Then, good. Cool. So I was actually gonna, and I think I've told a lot of people this, I was gonna open this up by making a lot of people uncomfortable, but I had to test my joke beforehand, and I decided not to because people told me that I made a joke about the fact that my grandmother recently passed away, and I'm totally fine about it, that it would probably make people incredibly uncomfortable. So that was the uncomfortable joke that was meant to come, but it is no longer coming because that is bad, and people would be like, do you really want a hug? And I'd be like, yes, but also, no, it's fine. So instead, I'm just going to do the speech, right? I'm fine, right? But anyway, so what do we get out from Julie? I will deal with that later on. But from Ben, right? I think, and I also think this is the issue that I have with Ellen's speech too, right? I think they tell me why things are bad, but never tell me why anything else is better. They tell me that science is inherently bad for all these systematic reasons, but never tell me how necessarily those issues about how women are treated in society necessarily is changed in some world where science isn't the issue, right? They often, no thank you, right? They often exist independent of that science, right? They often exist because there are societal norms that exist around that have led to those outcomes accruing, right? But also, Ben's thing about economics and the famine, right? I think there's probably other reasons, and the same thing with Ellen, that people discriminate against you or let you starve to death because they necessarily didn't view you as, like in the context of the Irish famine, as human, right? But on the context of science, right? I just think it is better to have people accept authority of a flawed scientific concept of science to prevent them accepting crazier worldviews in like this some form of post-truth world, right? Because look, what do I think science represents, right? I think science represents truth, right? But also it's because that thing is instantly like approved, right? Insofar as when a scientist has an outcome and he believes that it is true, as the second up speaker also says, right? It's that reputation within that community often decides whether those things are published or not, or whether they're given credence and whether it's true, whether the outcomes of that test are necessarily true, right? Because that evidence is necessarily has to be objectively true, right? Because you can go through every single step of that test to make sure that they were ethical, but also make sure that what they're saying is true, right? And when that happens, right, I think it just means that that is the reason that people trust science, right? It's because those steps have been taken for decades upon decades to reach that level of like epistemic understanding, right? But also, sure, go for it.
So that doesn't apply to the field of social sciences in particular, because that doesn't take into account like the power relations between the researcher and the research. It doesn't take into account the fact that people are often uncomfortable reporting how they feel to a person in authority, and so it doesn't actually provide us with any form of actual truth, and just provides another tool by which people can become oppressed.
But I think that point of information is self-defeating, because another tool in which they are oppressed means that they are always going to be oppressed independent of that. But also, secondly, I just think that means, like within that context, right? But secondly, I just think that means that those individuals, like those power dynamics should be shifted, but the outcomes that they often aspire to do so are necessarily good, and that thing can be changed. I'm not sure why that thing is always bad in and of itself, right? But also, what do I think this means, right? I think it means that people are likely to take vaccinations. It's why you trust those vaccinations, because those outcomes are necessarily proven to be true and also to help people, or it's just curious to medicine in general, right? When Julie says that this has led to racist science, right? The issue that I have with the proposition is racism is something that exists in everyday life now and historically, right? But the thing is, when a racist is racist, they're always going to choose to be racist or be a white supremacist. When they try to back it up with science, that science is almost entirely disproven in every single circumstance, because that science is inherently motivated by race. Your bias has to be flagged, but also it's often untrue because you skip corners to prove what you want to prove, and that is why those things that were proved in the 50s and 60s around race relations and racist things are disproven, because those individuals are often, no thank you, often, right? Because the truth isn't always there, right? But I think that also just applies to things around power dynamics. And anyway, but also about trust, right? Because I think the trust that I, as a person, and everyone in this room largely has around science is because of that, right? It's because the evidence and the efficacy of the outcomes of that scientific research and that scientific methods, right? But why this, right? Because look, you're literally putting in certain circumstances drugs, liquids into your body to relieve a suffering that is placed upon you, and individuals have to have like a lot of trust to do this, right? And I think largely has succeeded, right? We have like HIV, people with HIV can now live comfortable lives and no longer have to deal with the disease in the same way they did 40 years ago. But it's also things such as the common cold or flu that would otherwise kill people. Now you largely don't have to because of science, right? It's that trust that you do, right? Because when you see like uncontacted people in like the Brazilian Amazon rainforest, when people come into contact with them, the reason they die is because they haven't had access to that science or that like immunity built up, right? That the things like that mean that they don't trust that science because they've never been socially conditioned to. But often that means that their life gets worse because they can't access that science because they don't trust that science, right? But also brings me into why other belief systems are bad. No, thank you, right? Because it's doubt, right? That doubt in and of itself is bad, right? Because when I POI Julie about people don't understand it because of the jargon that is often put into scientific journals or peer review, right? I think that jargon is always going to exist in almost any academic field, right? Just to explain things, right? But I just think that when people don't understand it and they try to critically analyze it without having a degree or at least studied science in undergrad, they're always going to come up short, right? Because they don't have the entire knowledge around how that works, and when they start doing that and they're like, oh, this doesn't make sense to me. Actually, what if they meant this, right? Because you're always coming from a point of view of like not having the educational function to understand that. I just think that that means that you're less likely to accept science, right, in all instances, right, because you're likely to believe in pseudosciences because they're far easier to explain to you, right, because you just say that if you do this thing, that this suddenly makes your life better without going through all the scientific analysis that led you to the outcome of like the scientific test that often happens. This looks like pseudosciences. This looks like homeopathic things that people often take because they've rejected science, all right, and they necessarily believe that is true, right? It's the things that Julie tells you around pseudoscience. I think it just happens when people often reject science en masse, right? I just think that when thinking about this debate, right, I think that science has flaws, but mostly science and the things that it has around vaccinations and cure medicine and like illnesses around that is like always better, right? Because it always helps those people who are more likely to die. Beg you to pose.
Thank you, Jess, for that speech. I'd like now to call on Dara Center to close the case for the proposition.
Hi everyone. So I'm a maths and philosophy student, so I spend like half my time in the Hamilton, half my time in the arts box, so like I know both camps, like everyone can trust me about this. So my speech is a bit of a follow-up from Ellen's, which wasn't planned. I'm a bit mad about that. But anyway, right, so so the first philosophy module we did was philosophy of religion, which was basically our lecturer telling us, like, here are all the reasons people use to justify God, and then here are all the, like, many, many problems with them, and then you come out of the lectures thinking, like, who believes that stuff, right? But then, like, you know, this term we're doing philosophy of science, and the amount of like axioms, the amount of things you have to believe, like without any logical justification, to eventually arrive at believing the truth of some science is like insane. And there's a load of stuff that we just don't consider. There is a huge amount of philosophical problems that have gone on for like ages that no one in this time right now even considers, because we're brought up in a very like employment-focused education system. There's a huge STEM job market. Everyone's like pushed into learning about science. And so that's my first bad point. Since half of my degree is philosophy, I'm a bit sad that it's kind of dying outside of a lecture theatre. So like things I'm going to mention, like you're gonna think they're really stupid, but so you know, all these like pop philosophical problems that you hear, like, oh, how do we know that the world wasn't created like 10 minutes ago? How do I know that like anyone else here doesn't, like, they all feel things and see things the same way I do? How do you know that like that bottle to me is the same as it is to you? How do I trust an authority that I know nothing about? Like, why do I trust the big scientific authority? All of this type of stuff, right? These are things that like for ages philosophers talked about. Now everyone finds stupid. I think that's sad. But anyway, point of this, the point of this, I think it's bad also because like for ages we use religion to explain everything, and now we're in this narrative where science is going to explain everything, and neglecting philosophy I think is bad. No, I don't have the phone. Right, so anyway, this motion was not supposed to be about philosophy. So here's a big problem, right? And I think particularly, so most of what I think we're like regretting on the prop side, or at least I don't know what these guys regret, but my regret is the extent to which we have faith in science, right? And not the fact that we have faith in science at all, right? There's certain like situations where you have to accept a bunch of axioms to be able to say anything about those situations, and science might be good for that. But it extends further than it should, and I think we're also not taught like to think about how far it extends, whatever. So like, let me explain. So let's say you're like a student and you're like really active and you like run around a lot and you have a lot of friends that you talk to loads and you like take care of yourself, and then all of a sudden something happens, you get like really, really depressed. Right? And so you just want to like stay in your room all day. You don't want to talk to anyone. You want to be alone. Right? The scientific opinion or whatever that you'd hear was that like, you know, your amygdala is shrinking or whatever, and you've got to like keep talking to people, keep active, eat well. That's going to like cure your depression. This is something that like a lot of people believe. But like the thing is like the amount of jumps you have to get towards to believe something like that, rather than what like everything in your mind is telling you. I think like we're set up to make that decision, even though I think, like, when you really think about it, it is, in a way, unreasonable. And I also think that it's problematic that society expects you to make those decisions, that science all of our faith in science leads to people kind of like oversimplifying like very, very complex situations. So there's like if that happens to you, you have a load of people around, like, I don't know, like I think like Joe Rogan or whatever says this shit all the time, that like people who have like all of these problems, they just need to do this because science proves that like you have to do this because there are scientific studies that like these are the solutions to all these problems. And people's like faith that that's how it works and that's how simple it is, I think is really problematic for people who experience like very, very complex issues, and people don't recognize that like the way that they think about them, their own solutions to them could be valid as well. They think that like science is going to explain all that stuff. So I think that's really problematic. Okay, so my big hot take here, right, is that, and you might have heard it in POIs, that there's a big distinction between like the scientific establishment and like scientists, or like science itself, right? So I think you can't say that like science is what scientists think, for a number of reasons, right? I wrote it down, right? So like first of all, like what makes a scientist, right? It can't just be that they're like part of some institution. It's because they like follow certain rules, they do certain things, they deal with certain stuff. And like, what if you discovered like one day that like every single scientist was all like corrupt in some way? Would you lose your faith in science? No, you would still believe all of the same things, that like empirical data is how you solve stuff. You would still believe in science, but you would distrust the scientific establishment or whatever. And this is what happens to all of these like harms that come from the upside about like pseudoscience and all that type of stuff. So I want to read you the like first piece of the description for the official Flat Earth and Globe discussion group that has over 100,000 members. So it's this is a serious scientific page about the shape of the Earth and other misinformation being pushed by the masses by the globalist elite looking to govern men and secure world domination, right? So they think that they're doing science, and all their posts say like, this is the science we're doing. They do like empirical tests. They might do it badly, and I'm sure there's loads of stuff they don't know about, but the fact that we have a huge amount of faith in science, the fact that everyone has a huge amount of faith that like empirical data is going to explain all these things, means that when they, for whatever reason, distrust like the big scientific establishment, they have a huge amount of faith in science, so they think, all right, I'm going to do my own experiments, and this is how I'm going to figure out all these things about the world. And I think that's problematic, because I think that, like, you know, the huge amount of faith, like, and you think the same thing about like anti-vaxxers that all believe, like, the first things they'll tell you, like, why are you an anti-vaxxer or whatever, they'll say, oh, the studies, like scientific studies prove that, because there's one guy who got like, whatever, that there's scientific studies that prove that vaccines cause autism. If there was no scientific studies, if people didn't have this huge, if people didn't have this huge faith in science, then it wouldn't lead to them to becoming anti-vaxxers, etc. So I think that like our faith in science is all of these kind of like groups that believe in like different science. I don't think they're like people who don't believe in science or don't have faith in science. I think they're people who have faith in a different science, and I think our faith in science drives them like further. Okay, so just finally, let me talk about, right, so Jack, talk about people that said things, right? So Jack, something you said was that like people will always be racist or something like that was your big point, but you just kind of neglected the fact that like we on the prop side were saying that like people who are racist use this as a tool, like use science and this bad science or all of our faith in science as a tool to do bad things, to make things worse for everyone in the world. So like taking away that tool is obviously a good thing, just because everyone knows there are people that are racist, but like the fact that that tool is being taken away from them, or the fact that that tool wouldn't exist if we didn't have this big faith in science, would be good, right? So regret the faith in science, say aye when Tigran tells you to, and
thank you, Derek, for your speech. And now I'd like to call upon Thomas to close the case for the opposition and to close the case for the argument.
Is this your first time?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Okay, so you're simply entitled to making science. Would you like to keep them or yeah.
Yes. I would like to waive them. Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I actually do want to take this to philosophy, but first I would actually like to agree with the prop. The question, to a small degree, you guys make a very, very good point about authority, and personally, I lay the blame at the junior cert, to be honest. I reckon this kind of thinking where, scientific facts are kind of handed to you or spoon-fed to you isn't the way that we should be taught. It's certainly not the way that science actually works. And yeah, it's certainly quite problematic. We all remember, Hooke's law, the vacuole, that diagram of the male reproductive system, but that's not really what we're doing. So I would like to say that the philosophy behind science is something that we can have faith in. As a result, we can have faith in science as a whole. So another kind of problematic Nobel Prize winner, Ernest Rutherford, kind of follower of like nuclear physics or something along those lines, basically said all science is either physics or stamp collecting. And he's basically having a big dig at biology, saying these chaps don't know what they're on about. They're literally just kind of recording stuff. And yeah, he was mostly right up until the kind of philosophy kind of caught up and we kind of started developing more sophisticated methods. So basically, this Austrian dude called Karl Popper, he kind of figured the whole business out. And there's kind of a difference here. One of these is science and the other isn't. And he kind of came to the conclusion, Einstein said things that you can prove wrong. Freud didn't. So Einstein said, I don't understand any of Einstein's stuff, but he said light will be bent by gravity. And that's observable. So a bunch of astronomers got on a boat, went down to the equator, looked at an eclipse, and right enough, you could see the light from certain stars being bent behind the disk of the sun. Einstein's theory had been put to the test. They'd failed to prove it wrong. Freud, he had an idea that our dreams are a manifestation of our true desires, which is kind of weird. Has that chap ever had a nightmare? Bit odd. But anywho, one of his patients came to him and was like, Doc, I had a nightmare. I had a dream about going on holiday with my mother-in-law, and that's really something I don't desire. And he was like, right, rather than let his theory be in tatters, he went, no. You wanted to prove me wrong. And his theory, at least according to him, was intact. And that's the kind of demarcation between science and pseudoscience. And we have to be careful when we say, science has done all these harmful things. Has science done all these harmful things, or has pseudoscience, things like scientific racism, have never been science, ever. That was always pseudoscience.
Yeah, but if people think that they're science because of the faith in science, these negative effects can still happen. So the faith in science, even if it's not good science, people still have faith in it because they can't differentiate.
That's a good point. I suppose before people like Popper, it was kind of all considered to be science, but now we know about falsifiability. Hopefully, with due diligence, that kind of nasty thing won't happen again. So a kind of idea, like it's all well and good to hear from the philosophers and all that, and it's all very well and good in the arts block, but do these philosophical ideas actually work in science? And as it turns out, they pretty much. Oh yeah, sure.
So I have a question about. So what we're saying is that the faith in science is that the application of scientific methods and scientification of non-traditional science subjects, and this faith has led to really terrible outcomes for people, especially oppressed people. And I'm wondering how is this still okay in Europe?
I think a lot of the points you're making, perhaps, I don't know enough about them maybe, but the blame there might lie at the hands of the people doing the science. It's not the method per se, it's people misusing the method, Scientists aren't perfect, and we certainly don't always do it right. And that is a good point, especially like with your thing about drugs and the menstrual cycle. Like that's a huge oversight. That's not a problem with the science as the method, but someone should have picked up on that. And that's the fault of the person, rather than the fault of the method, So basically, the whole idea about falsificationism is that it's very, very difficult to make objective claims about the universe. It's really quite hard. And when that's your kind of point of being a scientist, that's a big problem. So say if you wanted to know, is absolutely everyone in the Hamilton a big nerd? You could go down there. Wouldn't recommend it. You could just simply observe, or you could ask, and you might find 500 nerds, 1,000 nerds, God forbid. And you might go back to the arts block and say, right, I found all these nerds. But does that mean that you actually have proved that everyone in the Hamilton is a nerd? Not really, because you can never know it all, But if you were to go down again and find even just one normal person, As difficult as that would be, if you find just one of us, you can objectively say that not everyone in the Hamilton is a big nerd. Not that that's true, but that's the kind of basis that where the kind of statistical tests and stuff. I'll just keep zooming on because yeah. Anywho, so basically, that is what I meant to say. Basically, scientists, I can understand our skepticism in certain scientists. Certain scientists have made great leaps forward in their own fields and also believe some very, very wacky things. Authority is a problem in and of itself if you don't check it, but the method is very, very sound, philosophically speaking at least. And another philosopher of science, Thomas Samuel Kuhn, he envisioned science as kind of like a cyclical process of a big discovery, then scientists work on it and they move on and they find another big discovery. So, you went from like Aristotle to Newton, and then people worked on Newton and they figured out, oh, actually, Einstein was right. And basically, the grand point here I'm making is that science really is a process. And we're at the coalface of it now. We're always moving forward. We're always moving towards the truth. And yeah, basically, even if we're not there right now, even if there's really big questions left unanswered, there's still diseases we're left untreated, questions that we really don't know the answer to. That's, in my opinion, no reason to lose our faith in science, which I think is sound. I think the philosophy behind science is sound. I think the method is sound, and that's why I beg you to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for that fine speech. I will now put the question to the House on the motion that this House regrets our faith in science. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say nay. Nay. Motion is defeated. Cool. Now it's my turn to get on for a few minutes. That was a very interesting debate, I will say. And I think the main takeaway I can get from it is that no matter whether you're a scientist or not a scientist or philosopher, or that's what people do, there's this culture of blind faith, not just in science, but in everything. If somebody tells you something, I've noticed that people don't seem to be as skeptical as they maybe used to be. Now that you have access to the internet and stuff like that, and you see constantly the same thing over and over and over again, that kind of builds up your own perception of an idea. And that idea stays in your head, and it's very difficult to get rid of. But in terms of this debate, in terms of regretting our faith in science, I have a few specific points. I'll let you decide which side of the debate I'm on. Overall, I think having faith in science is good. But the thing about science is you have to be very careful in the field with the language that you use. You can't go and say, this is it, this is the truth, there's nothing else, this is exactly it, you have to believe me, that's it. There are arguments all the time. If I show you this pen, and I ask you how long is this pen, you say approximately 10 centimeters, something like that. Note that I'm using approximate. If I go down further and say, I don't know, 10 point something something to the 100th decimal place, even then I'm still not right. And there are arguments left and right about it. So we can't say for certain that these ideas are strong and direct and concrete, that this is it. The culture behind science is also a terrible thing. There's one example that people, I don't think, I assume because most of the people here are not scientists. So they didn't really pick up on this example called Ernest Rutherford. He was a scientist about 10, 15 years ago, and he had a fantastic scandal where he was putting out one scientific paper in less than a day. So over a course of 3 months, he probably put out maybe 120, 150 papers. I don't know if anybody's written a paper before, but it takes 6 months at least to write one paper. and maybe it takes another year to get that published. But these papers were written in less than a day, sent off and published and peer-reviewed by hundreds of people because they wanted to believe what it said. They wanted to believe that this guy was a genius, that this guy was putting out scientific, highly, highly important scientific work, and this guy was proving everyone else's theories right and putting it forward. This guy was a massive idiot. Because you want to scandal, you want to fake it, science, fine. But don't copy and paste diagrams into several different papers and say that they're different things. Don't use the same diagram and have the same noise levels in the exact diagram, in the exact graphs, and copy and paste that in a different graph and say that's a different thing. That's bad. Don't do that. I think overall, a blind faith in anything is a terrible, terrible idea. If you spend any time in science, you realize that science is more of an art than it is a science. People really see the scientific method as more of a guideline than necessarily gospel. And things slip through the cracks, and when the things slip through the cracks, sometimes it gets out to the public. And if that idea or something like that, take artifacts for example, if that confirms some of his own ideas, then it's incredibly difficult to try and argue the other side or say, using correct scientific terms, there's enough evidence to say that this maybe won't harm you or something like that. People don't like that. People like concrete stuff. People like, they won't kill you. This will save your babies. No autism whatsoever. There's a tiptoe method that we need to take with it. I'd say, going forward, if any scientist or anybody that wants to go into the field, I'd say think more like a philosopher than necessarily a scientist. You shouldn't stop asking why at the moment you sent your paper for submission and that's it, you can forget about it. Never ask why this thing happened, and if it gets published, that's it. Keep asking why. Keep always asking why. Because if you don't ask why, problems like anti-vax, problems like people denying global warming, problems like people not believing GMOs are safe, slip through the cracks, and they can cause irreparable damage. So with that, I'll stop yapping now. And I shall now call upon the auditor to announce the Society's open event.
First of all, I think we throw a round of applause to all of our speakers, and particularly our chair this evening, so if you would join me in thanking them for their fine words. It's also worth noting that Tigran Moore is an ex-officer of the Society who served as censor 2 years ago. Yeah, and was an MC before that, so we're delighted to have him back in a slightly different capacity this evening. There are a couple of big announcements, I suppose, before we go upstairs for a reception and continue the debate up there over a glass of wine or a glass of Schlur, which is like fake wine. Falsifiable wine. But I suppose the key announcement is that HIS 250, which is like a set of anniversary celebrations that we have for this significant year of the Society's existence, is currently published. You can see all of the events both on Facebook and our website. So our website is tcbhist.com, and /HIS250 if you want to see those specific events. They range from panel discussions with say like Pascal Donoghue and Sir Paul Collier, or Mary Robinson, who was Secretary General of Amnesty International, and key speeches from the heads of European institutions like President Prodi, President Van Rompuy, and lots of ambassadors, so on and so forth. It's a really quite a hectic week, but I hope to see some of you at those events. They're really quite excellent. So you can find them all on our Facebook page or on our website. If you enjoyed tonight's debate and you may enjoy next week's debate, it's on climate change. Jack, who puts together the debates, has written, we are all going to die in a climate apocalypse, and debate cannot change that, but it should be a fun evening. So maybe come along anyway. So the motion is on the back of your archer returns. This House believes that the duty to stop climate change lies with the individual. That then brings me to your orator returns. Please, once you fill them out, give them to Maggie, who will be collecting them out the door. The guidelines that you can use are inside, in the middle, and you just fill out the boxes and go along. And again, these are important because they determine the prizes that we will win. So please fill them out, give them to Maggie, and throw this over the section upstairs. I see the floor back to the chair.
I call this answer then.
Like voting for yourself. Put your own. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That should be Alex's only job. Alex is this member of committee. He's on committee last year. It's like, he's not really around. He doesn't know. But we never got into resolving. We're like,
I don't feel like that.
good job. I'm a fake person on this thing.
You're an honorary scientist.
you said no scientific tool.
I was right. I said very good. Yeah, that's genuinely very important. Made the point. That's your first Luke asked me, was it your first time speaking? I was like, no, I don't think it is. But I'm sorry.
No, I wasn't sure.
That is technically your first time. That's false. You guys genuinely, like, I tend not to genuinely were very, very but no, it's good. Especially when we aren't seasoned debaters, it's kind of debate and then you know what? Other people did it. Great time. I'd do it again. You were so like, do. Yeah. Excellent delivery. You get all the congratulations. Go take them.